Blog Talk Radio. Hi, and welcome to The Art of Film Funding. I'm your co-host, Claire Papin, along with Carol Dean, author of the best-selling book, The Art of Film Funding. Carol is also the founder and president of From the Heart Productions and the host of this show. Today we are interviewing two authors, Gail Chandler and Shauna Hannon, of the book Scripting a Sermon. Gail Chandler is based in Northern California and was nominated twice for a Cable Emmy for comedy editing and has trained hundreds of professionals on digital editing systems and students on editing systems practices and theory. Additionally, she taught editing practices and history at Loyola Marymount University and California State Universities at Long Beach, Los Angeles, and Northridge. The Reverend Dr. Shauna Hannon is professor of homiletics at Pacific Lutheran Theological Seminary and core doctoral faculty in religion and practice for the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, California. This year, she's celebrating 25-plus years of ordained ministry and the publication of a new book, Scripting a Sermon, Using the Wisdom of Filmmaking for Impactful Preaching, co-authored with filmmaker Gail Chandler. She's the author of The People's Sermon, Preaching as a Ministry of the Whole Congregation, and co-editor of Eco-Lutheranism, Lutheran Perspectives on Ecology. And Carol, their book, Scripting a Sermon, is a book for preachers encouraging them to look at and try the techniques preachers use to reach and impact audiences in creating their sermons.
Yes, Claire, we're so excited to have Gail and Shauna. Thank you very much for joining us.
Great to be here.
Good. So what we want to do today is cover the visual storytelling and structure in script and sermon, and using a central theme. All of these things are to guide the plot of the sermon. So the first thing I'd like to know is, Gail, what inspired you and Shauna to write the book?
Well, Shauna had been teaching for years scripting to her homiletic students, and she was looking for a co-author who knew filmmaking to create this book about preaching and filmmaking. And it really comes out of Southern Methodist University in Dallas, which is doing a Preaching and series. And they also have, the first book was Preaching and Marketing, and the second was Preaching and Humor. And Shauna proposed this one to them. And it's also sponsored by the Perkins Center of Preaching Excellence, which is also at SMU. And Shauna, do you want to say something about how you got into this?
Sure. I've been thinking for years about how looking at the craft of filmmaking might help preachers in their craft of preaching sermons. And so in my courses, I've used bits and pieces, and I thought it was time to write a book about it, but realized I'm not a filmmaker. And when this Preaching and series came out and said the preaching person has to find a co-author of the other discipline, I thought, perfect. And then I went looking for a filmmaker and was led to Gail.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. Well, in the book, Scripting a Sermon, you draw parallels between filmmaking and preaching. The question is, how do these two art forms overlap in terms of storytelling?
I can respond to that. Oh, Gail,
sure,
you
for it.
Start.
Go ahead, Shauna.
Well, I think in some ways I think it's worth saying that the differences are many, and so we acknowledge in the book that there are many differences. But I could not help seeing the resonance of kind of a narrative arc. A film opens someplace, it closes someplace, same with a sermon, and then decisions have to be made about how to move from the first scene to the last scene. That alone shows us some similarities. Gail, you were going to add something.
Yeah, I think, it's also, we talk a lot in the book about how do you get into the story. That's one thing filmmakers always talk about. Do you start with the person born? Pretty much not a whole lot. You jump right into their life now. And how does that translate to delivering a sermon? Do you start in BC or do you BCE, or do you start now? And also, how do you go back and forth in time as far as telling the story? Do you bookend it? Do you start in the past and then start at a certain point and go all the way through and return to that point? I mean, there's many ways of storytelling that really do apply not only to films and novels, but to creating sermons.
Wonderful, yes. Robert Kaufman, writer, Hollywood writer, said you never start at the beginning of a scene, you start in the middle. There's so much you can leave out. Start in the middle, get moving. And so you're right. There's a million ways to start it. But the question, next question is, are you recommending a 3-act structure, the same as we have in film?
No, not really. We talk about beginning, middle, and end, actually. We have a whole chapter on scenes and beats, and we definitely talk about scenes. And so, yes, in a way, yes. We actually do recommend that preachers work with beginning, middle, and end.
Good.
I would say though that the 3-act structure would be too narrow of a focus. That my encouragement of preachers is to broaden their repertoire of what we would call sermon form, and very often it's not similar to a 3-act structure. But absolutely what Gail says is to be mindful of a beginning, a middle, and end is very important. Okay.
Well, filmmaking, as you know, is often about capturing emotion and connecting with an audience. So how do you see these principles translating into sermon preparation and delivery?
Yeah, I think
we hit impact right from the beginning. I think this is something Shauna wrote about in her first book, The People's Sermon, which is including everybody in this conversation that happens on Sunday, but can continue before that and after that. So we talk about how in the first chapter, and we really carry it through the whole book, of thinking about your audience and knowing who your audience is, who the preacher is talking to, who the filmmaker wants to reach. We make the parallels.
Yes, that's so important. And of course, I was raised in the Baptist Church in Dallas, Texas, where SMU is. So I know about emotion and connecting with an audience, because my pastor was very good at that. I always felt like he was talking directly to me, and I think that's what he wants to achieve, isn't it?
I would say that's one of the hopes, yes.
Yes.
I think that the emotional impact is important, and I think often preachers are discouraged to be overly emotional in some circumstances, just because some people might accept as being manipulative. I think it's important to name from the beginning, and yet I don't think we can underemphasize the importance of a kind of emotional impact. And that's where film, I mean, we want to be emotionally impacted by a film, and we're safe in being emotionally impacted by a film. And that's a good question for preachers to ask. What is the emotional impact you hope for your hearers?
Exactly, right. And what do you think is the significance of structure in both filmmaking and sermon writing? For example, can you break down how a sermon can follow a script in the same way that a film does?
Well, Shauna's actually been teaching for a long time. She has her students actually put she takes a biblical passage, a scene really, and puts it into script form. And this really helps them visualize and structure their sermons. We have an example of a film script, and then the passage, and then it scripted as a filmmaker would script it, a biblical passage.
Wonderful. Well, and now in the book you discuss the importance of visual storytelling in preaching. So tell us how a preacher can use imagery or visuals to make the message more compelling.
Shauna, why don't you chime in on
that?
Sure.
I think that in recent years people have used a screen in the sanctuary to actually literally show some images. I think in some ways what I'm thinking of in the book is maybe there wouldn't be an actual image, but it's an image that's conjured by the audience, the congregation, in their mind's eye. And as we know, words create certain images when people hear those words. And so the way a preacher crafts a particular combination of words or phrases would create an image, a desired image. The interesting thing here is a preacher may not overclaim what image she wants the hearers to envision in their mind's eye, but to leave it open for the congregation to conjure those images. Yet the preacher can make decisions about. First, the preacher should see a scene and describe that scene, and that doesn't mean they're going to have the exact same image that the congregation has. And so I think it's worth being in conversation with some people before the sermon around what images they conjure regarding a biblical passage, and then after the sermon finding out, what did you see? How did you see that scene when I was preaching it, for example? So it might be different in filmmaking than filmmaking in that way. The filmmaker gives the picture, literally the scene, and the preacher uses words to conjure certain visuals.
Exactly. Oh, that is so interesting to get feedback from the audience afterwards. Because a lot of deacons in the church would be available to tell the pastor what they were envisioning so that he could get an idea of the power of his words.
Mm-hmm. Yes, deacons and others, anyone who's willing to offer that kind of feedback. I think it's worth soliciting that kind of input, yes.
And
very important.
Last May, April, we went to SMU and did a day-long workshop with preachers and preaching students, and we took a biblical passage and we had them describe it visually in filmmaking terms, wide shot, close-ups, so on and so forth.
Wow. Yes.
And it was great because there were no wrong answers. And some people visualized the scene in a wide shot, and everybody could see it. And some people visualized it more. It was Jesus and Pontius, and some people saw them in a two-shot, and some people just had the focus on Jesus, and none of them was wrong. And it was all for an opening. So it was a way for preachers to open their minds and open their their hearers' minds and hearts, of course, too.
Exactly. Well, see, now a filmmaker would take the cut of the film. They often do, before they finalize it, they'll take it and start showing it to people to get feedback, and then they do the final cut.
Mm-hmm.
So for an important sermon, it might be of interest to some preachers to practice with this special group, get feedback if they were giving like a Christmas or Easter sermon that they really felt was important.
Yeah, that's a great point. We actually mentioned that, and I've mentioned that to preachers, veteran preachers, and new preachers alike. And there's some reticence around that, and I want to break down that reticence and say, why not try it out? Because we want not to assume that our words will do things. We want them to do the things that we hope will lead people in a positive direction. So go ahead and try it on for size. And we call that a kind of feed forward process. It's a weird word, but feed forward as opposed to the feedback on the back end. But I think that's great, Carol. And that's where filmmaking can help us. Yes.
Yeah,
sure.
we talk about
parallel.
We talk about focus groups in the book, that how filmmakers use them, or they just call their friends or their peers in to look at cuts as they go and scenes. And we encourage preachers to do the same, to collaborate with. We have a whole second chapter on collaboration and how a preacher might collaborate with her or his hearers, have certain designated ones that would listen or read or however they want to set it up.
What a great idea. Yes, because having spent so many years in the Baptist church, I know how important it is for people to get the message that the pastor is trying to give them. I mean, it's a big effort to maintain a church, and it's a big effort for the audience to get up, get dressed, and get there every Sunday. And they're only going to go back when they have felt that they received something of merit, because look what the preachers have to put up with today. I mean, YouTube alone has like 1 million images uploaded a day. So there is so much competing for your time that it's important for the pastors to have as many tools as possible. So I think your book is brilliant.
Well, thank you, Carol.
One thing thank you for saying that.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, one of the things that we found that carried over from filmmaking is point of view, and who's a lot of the biblical stories are familiar to everybody, but if you tell them from a different point of view, that makes the story come alive in another way. And it's the same, obviously the same with filmmaking. And also looking at whose point of view has been left out, which is obviously tends to be the women and others. So we really infuse that into the book also.
Good. That's wonderful. Well, in filmmaking, as you know, editing plays such a crucial role in creating the final product. So the question is, how does the editing process in sermon preparation help refine a message for greater impact?
I think that in a way we were just talking about that. You acknowledged it, Carol, that ministers don't have a lot of extra time, or as I think you said, put up with a lot. It's a tough call. It's a tough job, and there's often not a lot of time for editing or refining. And the first thing is preachers might consider starting a little sooner on their sermons. Now that's easy to say, more difficult to do. But if they start a little sooner, they have more time to refine. And I think if a preacher has just 5 minutes, they might look at their first sentence, or they might practice their closing 3 lines. And so they really have it down for the most impact. If they have a little more time, they might look at their major sections, or what we might call major moves, and then the transitions. Do the scene changes make sense? These are the kinds of questions that we're encouraging that preachers ask themselves to do that refining. But I think it actually goes back to preachers don't often think they should edit or refine, that whatever the first thought is what they should go with. And I'm recommending that preachers start early so they have enough time to go and refine. And then the second challenge is, what do I refine? And that's where our chapter on editing can help guide preachers. Okay, I have a little time to refine, to edit. What now? And there's some direct guidelines in that chapter for preachers.
Oh, wonderful. This is exactly what they need, because, as you know, so many people say that it all happens in the editing room, and that's where a lot of scenes end up on the editing floor. My son was an actor, I know. I thought you were in that film, Rick. Oh, I was, but I'm not now. So this is right. This goes on all the time. But in a sermon, it's learning or feeling into what is important and what keeps people's attention on the subject matter. How far I'm sorry. How far afield can you go and still bring them back? Yeah. Because if you're taking them, to a mountain top where 2 people are talking, do you want to leave them there and get the full impact, or bring it into today's world too soon? All of these things matter, don't they?
Yeah, I mean, my background was as an editor, so we definitely make the parallels between what a film editor would do and that process, from rough cut to locked cut, and how that would translate into creating a sermon.
It's so difficult for preachers to. Sorry, it's so difficult for preachers to leave on the cutting room floor the things that they've really loved and want to say, and yet I say nobody's going to go to a 400-hour film. We have to, and nobody wants a 2-hour sermon here. I mean, you have to leave some things behind, and just because you're leaving it behind for this sermon doesn't mean it might not have a cameo in a future sermon. But for now, stay focused. Stay focused. And that means leaving some beauties behind.
And, we talk about how editing truncates scenes, but also moves stuff around. And all that can happen where the film is really raw material until you get to the editing stage and where it's really created, and how that translates into creating a sermon.
Well, you would know, Gail, after being nominated twice for a Cable Emmy Award. I mean, this is really a great achievement. So, and your books on editing are brilliant. Most of the people I know in the industry have them. So putting your talents into the pastor's hands is a great gift, sincerely.
Well, it was a joy to work with Shauna. It was really a great collaboration. Better than a lot that I had in film, Gail. Frankly.
Thank you. But you can see why I chose Gail as my partner here in this process. And she brought so much.
We were total strangers, and somebody connected us through an email, and so here we are.
This is wonderful. Well, I want to know more. I want to know, how can a preacher incorporate pacing like a director or an editor does, because he needs that to maintain an audience attention. I saw a film the other night, and all I could say was the pacing was perfect. They would give me something horrific or some piece of information that was shocking, then they'd give me a time to absorb it, take a deep breath, and then they'd start back into something else serious. But pacing is a key factor, right?
Absolutely.
Correct.
I think your phrase, time to absorb, is one that I would like for all of us preachers to hear. Oftentimes, if people are standing up there and just reading from a piece of paper, I don't think that's preaching. I mean, we really need to be very, very present with our hearers. And oftentimes people feel like, oh, they're waiting too long. And I'm thinking, no, they need a longer pause. Let them absorb it and be curious about what comes next. And filmmakers know this very, very well. And so I might do an assignment like encourage preachers to go and find your favorite film and analyze like 5 minutes of it in terms of pacing. What's happening when there's no dialogue or very little sound? And what is that impact for you? What's happening in your mind? What are you curious about? And if we could instill that same kind of curiosity in congregation members, oh, now we have them. There's some impact there.
Yes, it's very true. It would work. Well, what role does the hook, that is the compelling opening, play in the sermon, and how does it compare to the opening scenes of a movie?
Well, I could say a little something about that. I think it's often said that unlike some other forms of art, the preacher doesn't necessarily have to hook people in because they're there sitting in the congregation waiting for the preacher to say something. We don't have to get their attention. We already have it. It's just possible to lose their attention. And that's where the hook comes in. Am I curious enough to keep listening? Because we all know there's so many other things in this world these days to think about. So that's the hook. Am I going to stay focused on what the preacher says and to pay attention? Maybe you want to add a little, Gail, about how filmmakers can help with that.
Yeah, we talk a lot about exposition in our chapter on film openings and sermon openings, and how filmmakers try to get through to engage the audience right away, and they want to use a hook, but they also need to relate certain facts. They need to have exposition, and that the exposition they want to do usually as quickly as possible, so people are already engaged in the movie and sticking with it and have enough information to stick around for the rest of it. And we definitely talk about, Shauna talked about how that translates to sermon writing.
Right. Okay, well, what do you think are some common mistakes that the preachers make that filmmakers avoid, and how can filmmakers and preachers learn from each other?
That's a good question. We actually started our collaboration a couple of years ago in saying, what are the problems here? What are the concerns that we're wanting this book to address? And I think one of the things for me was just sermons that go many, many directions. They're basically 20 sermons in one, and that's a concern. How do you stay on track? And sometimes maybe we've seen a film that could have been 4 films, like it was just a little much. Yet, when a film really focuses and is one film, we're absorbed into that. So I'd say that's a common mistake.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and Michael Weezy, who was a publisher who died a year ago, and that's how Carol and I got connected, because we both have books through Weezy's company, I believe.
Yes.
The last book he proposed to me that I wrote was Editing for Directors, and he said, each chapter should be about what are the pain points for a director, what are the places where they need help and they may not know it, but they may know it. And so that was a starting point for us. One of the things I learned, because I'm not a Christian and I don't regularly attend any religious services, was that, especially at the SMU workshop, I learned this phrase, landing the plane. And that is what preachers use for how are they going to end the sermon. And, it's like you think the plane's going to come in and land, and oops, it does a touchdown. That's not the ending. And this can happen a few times with sermons. And we know that happens with films. Sometimes they can have multiple endings where you go, really would have been okay if they ended it there. So there are some common mistakes that both filmmakers, that's an example of common mistake that both filmmakers and preachers make.
Yeah, it's true. I've seen a lot of films that they should have ended 10 minutes before. You're right. But in your book, you talk about the theme and the through line of a sermon. So how do filmmakers use the central theme to guide the plot, and how can the preacher do the same thing?
Well, I think it goes back to looking at the impact and looking at the story you want to tell from the beginning. I mean, I've written a bunch of scripts, and I always know where I'm starting and where I'm ending, but I always say it's like Kansas, the middle part of it. And so I think that's just something that as a filmmaker you have to work on, and a preacher too. Okay.
All right. I think it's really important to follow those guidelines for storytelling, because the best thing that could happen to a pastor or a church is for someone to leave there with a story in their mind and repeat it to someone else, or in today's world, to post it online. Right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's what you want.
I think one of the exactly, and it's so much work putting together a sermon, interpreting scripture and saying how is this a word for us today, and putting that message together, paying attention to the congregation. We want it to have an impact. We want it to live on past the Sunday morning worship service. And so that's one of the key questions from the start, is to say, what do we want the end result to be? And we begin our book with beginning with the end. And in preaching, we might call this we might call this the function statement. How is this sermon going to function in the lives of these congregation members, these hearers? What impact will it have in their lives as they go from this place? That's really important. And that's really the through line.
Yes.
And
hopefully it's empowering. Yes. Sorry, Carol. I didn't mean to interrupt there. But that's okay. No, I just say you want to walk out of church feeling empowered, and that you've learned something, and you are vibrating at a higher rate, that you've just touched on something very special in that moment. And that's where we start, actually, in the introduction of people talk about the film they just saw. They don't talk about the sermon they just heard, and that's what we want to have happen. That is a great goal, I'll tell you, for all of us, because that's what we want. We're there to get something. It may be selfish, but we want to feel something. And usually you want to feel more empowered, less stressed, more dedicated to your life, more happier. Just walk out of there happier. Those things are very important. Well, first of all, tell us where we can buy the book. Where is it for sale? Well, you can buy it at the usual online places, Amazon and so forth, and you can also buy it from Westminster John Knox, which is the publisher, and is a terrific Christian publisher with all kinds of books, children's books, theological books,
books for students, books for the general public. It's a large publisher, and it's been really good to work with them. This is my third publisher, so I can say that.
Oh, how nice. This is great.
Yeah.
Well, in closing, let me ask you, what do you hope readers take away from scripting a sermon? How do you envision this book changing the way that preachers think about their craft?
I have a lot to say about that. Gail, do you want to say a little something?
No, go. Why don't you take it, Shauna?
Okay.
Yeah, please.
Sure, yeah. First, I want preachers to think that there's a way to really refine and hone their sermons, and for that process to be delightful, and for there to be an impact, which, as you said, Carol, really, if it empowers the congregation, they'll give their preachers that feedback, like, that was amazing. I was different this week because of it. And that'll keep preachers going, right? That's positive. That's positive reinforcement for what is a difficult job these days. And so that's kind of the bigger hope. And then a more focused hope is that preachers aren't stuck thinking, well, if I want to improve my preaching and be more impactful, I don't have any idea how to do it. I just need to keep doing what I'm doing and hope it works. No, there's a way to refine it, and there are some key guidelines along the way for how preachers might do that. So it's a very practical book in that way. It's also, I think, really fun. Gail did a very good job of bringing in a variety of films and helping us dig into those films. So maybe the hope is we might look at films differently. We might experience them differently, which will then have an impact on our crafting and delivering of sermons as well.
And, maybe preachers will feel powerful like filmmakers. We did, early on, we did parallels, such as pulpit and screen and preacher and director, and maybe they can feel their power as sermons impacting people as filmmakers do.
Yes, because they are our storytellers. They're the Bible's storytellers. And it resonates with us. And we always feel like we're part of that world. Even though it was 2,000 years ago, I don't know, I always felt that is so connected to it because of the characters and how the characters were developed in the Bible, right?
Yes, we talk about characters in the book, and it's like a filmmaker. You're interpreting what it could be a current event, it could be something in the Bible. Whatever you're preaching about, you want to make that story and those characters alive and impact and connect to your hearers.
Mm-hmm. Oh, wonderful. Yeah, connect to your hearers.
That's what I think, connect to the hearers, but the first step in that, I think, is to really pay attention to your hearers. And I was really amazed at how much filmmakers, particularly like documentary films, have impact producers. I didn't know about that. Like people who are setting the stage for the greatest impact of a film, and for that story to really come alive for the viewers. We want that with this story that is the biblical story for people to have that experience and to carry that into their lives.
And to learn from it, because there's so many great teachings in there that we can learn from, and that comes from a well-told story. So thank you both so much for writing this book. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And we'll check back with you maybe a year from now and see how you're doing, what new things you're working on.
Oh, that would be terrific.
That would be fun.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you.
Thank you so much,
very
Carol.
much for.
Thank you, Carol, once again.
You're welcome. And Claire, thank you for hosting our show.
Yes.
As always, I very much enjoyed the conversation, and I learned a lot.
Yes, me too. It's wonderful. Well, best of luck to everyone. Bye for now.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Now, in its second edition, Carol Dean's popular book, The Art of Film Funding, has 12 new chapters to cover all areas of film financing and how to avoid expensive pitfalls. Learn how to start with an idea and end with a trailer, how to make an ask for money, create your story structure and your trailer, legal advice, fair use, successful crowdfunding, how to ask for music rights, and what insurance you can't shoot without. Available on Amazon under Carol Dean and at FromTheHeartProductions.com. I want to remind our listeners that David Raiklin is a brilliant and talented award-winning musician who scores films and can compose music for a trio or for a full orchestra. David is a very good friend to the independent filmmaker and comes highly recommended by From the Heart Productions. If you need music to help tell your story, please contact him at davidraiklin.com. That's David, RAIKLEN.com. And Carol and I want to thank you for tuning in to The Art of Film Funding. Please visit our website at FromTheHeartProductions.com. You can also find us on Facebook and Twitter. Good luck with your films, everyone.
When it's PCS time, you know the drill. Pack, research the new base, get the kids in school, because family supports family. At American Public University, we support military families with flexible, affordable online education that moves with you. As a military spouse, your tuition rate is the same as your partner's, just $250 per credit hour. American Public University, education that moves with you. Learn more at apu.apus.edu/military.